And that is why there's such a push towards ethnic cleansing, essentially, of the space. It's, you know, having this clear run to build this horrible bastard vision of what they're putting forward, devoid of any pesky Palestinian resistance that would hold them back.
History loves its mirrors, but not every reflection is kind. People love to draw parallels between Ireland and Palestine. Colonized lands, partitioned walls, visible and invisible. It sounds neat, but too neat. Because those parallels, they flatten more than they reveal. They make sound rhyme like reason. They forget that each struggle lives in its own atmosphere, in its own silence, in its own moral geometry, in its own kind of wound. Browne, who I interviewed in Dublin, is from the north of Ireland, and he's one of the few who resist that comfort. He doesn't chase resemblance, he listens for resonance. He looks at how two different histories can vibrate against each other, not to compare but to expose what power tries to make incomparable. And his work? It cuts through the slogans. He asks how people can actually live after empire, how they can live after the grand delusions of the British Empire have crumbled, how memory and education and just getting through the day can become acts of defiance, sometimes quiet, sometimes not so quiet. But to really engage with that, to feel the weight of it, you need time. You need space for complexity. That's why I'm building my community on Substack, a place for those who believe that understanding conflicts takes more than just headlines and hashtags. So if you sense, like I do, that the same forces that in their ignorance were mapping the borders in Belfast and Bethlehem are now scripting the world that we wake up in, join me there. Because this isn't just about looking back at history. It's about seeing how those same hands are shaping the choices in front of us right now. And it's about deciding whether to think on your own or let someone else do the thinking for you. Professor Browne, and I think that's right away the first correction you're going to make. Lovely having you in this improvised setting here in Dublin. Really appreciate that you came down here.
Oh, it's my pleasure, yeah. Okay. Appreciate it.
Professor
Brendan.
At the Trinity College here in Dublin, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Now, one of the things that right away kind of spiked my interest is that you actually have taught on and correct me if I'm wrong, a university, the Al-Quds University in Palestine.
Yeah, so it's Al-Quds University.
Al-Quds, sorry.
Yeah. No, it's okay. Al-Quds is Arabic for Jerusalem.
Yeah.
I taught there I've taught there twice actually. So I taught there for a year in 2015. I was a professor of international law and transitional justice. And then I went back for during my sabbatical in 2020. So that was during COVID, just before COVID hit. And that period was disrupted. So it was actually locked down in Bethlehem during COVID. But yeah, so I've taught at that university, which is a really interesting space to be, because it's the only Palestinian university in Jerusalem. So hugely significant, very important. And it's based in a place called Abu Dis. So yeah, amazing.
Incredible.
Yeah.
And you are a really smart guy. You have a number of degrees, which I will not mention, but you have also a PhD in sociology from the Queen's University in Belfast.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Now, for an uninformed person like myself, what I have observed is that you have Irish Europarliamentarian being really, really outspoken and explicit when it comes to the so-called Israel-Palestine conflict, which Netanyahu frames as Palestine-Israel conflict, if you listen carefully. Why is that? Why are the Irish so outspoken vis-a-vis the conflict that we're seeing in the Middle East?
There's a number of reasons. First of all, Ireland has experienced decades of violent colonialism with Britain next door. It has its own long history of dealing with colonial violence. And so it has this kind of almost natural empathy for other people who are experiencing similar things. Ireland also went through issues with forced displacement on many occasions, so there's a natural, as I say, empathy with that. Also went through the tragedy of enforced starvation during An Gorta Mór, during the Great Hunger, during the famine, as people would also sort of refer to it as. So there's a kind of natural predisposition towards those who are struggling for self-determination, struggling for liberation, and that's where you get some of these very vocal MEPs in the European Parliament. But it isn't universal, there is this kind of sense that it's the Irish government or, Irish political elites all round. That's not the case. It's very much a grassroots sense of solidarity and a grassroots empathy, because if you actually look at the response of the Irish government during the last 2 years of the genocide, you'll find, in fact, it's been quite a conservative approach. So yes, we can pat ourselves in the back and sort of say that connection is very, very strong, but it is very much a grassroots driven process. So yeah, that's one of the main reasons.
You said the Irish, they experienced suppression on their own, which is true. And if I'm not completely mistaken, Ireland got its independence about 100 years ago. Now the Jews in the Second World War, but the Jews also experienced oppression, prosecution for a very long period of time. So would we not expect also some kind of empathy based on their own collective experience vis-a-vis the Palestinians?
Well, yeah, I mean, we also have a complex history here in Ireland when it comes to support for the Jewish people as well. The fledgling Irish state, for example, initially was very supportive of Jewish self-determination and a Jewish state in the Middle East, and not a lot of people put a lot of attention on that. So actually that's an important thing to put out there as well. In the early stages, the Irish government at the time were very supportive of Jewish self-determination, a state in Israel for the Jewish people. So, but yeah, you would expect a bit more from the Irish government, I guess, at this moment in time. But you have to also appreciate, which I'm sure all of your viewers will, that Ireland is very connected to the American reality, to America in general. So we'll kind of fall into line on occasion when it comes to decisions being made in America, decisions being driven by the American government. And as we've seen for the last 2 years, this has been absolutely very much a genocide that's sponsored by the American government. So the connection between Ireland and America is one that's extremely strong, and that's one that they're not going to want to disrupt too much. When you think about the amount of business that comes here, when you think about the amount of American interests, when you think about, for example, big tech organizations that are based in Ireland as well. Apple, Meta, IBM, Hewlett Packard, the list is huge. And so there's a tension, let's say, then, with, on the one hand, wanting to give platitudes and strong words of condemnation or strong words of support for Palestine and self-determination, but actually engaging in anything materially to support that, I would say, is a little bit different. And in fact, there was a very important article that was published in Counterpunch not so long ago by a researcher called Dara Cogley, who highlighted very clearly the links between Ireland and Israel and Ireland and America and business and whatever. And it showed that Ireland is the second largest exporter and importer of Israeli goods in Europe, which is quite significant when you think about our projection of solidarity. So I think that's important to platform as well.
I'm not done yet with introducing you, but I can't resist to ask another question. So if we turn this around and look at the English Empire, seeing what they have caused historically in all the major, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Ireland, Israel, Palestine. So wherever the British had historically their fingers in, we see the fault lines cracking and having also serious, Afghanistan, Pakistan, 1 million dead or more, right? So from that perspective, would we not expect a little bit more consciousness from the British government, especially, seeing the history, seeing what have caused vis-a-vis the Palestinians?
I mean, we can optimistically say we would like to see that, but are these major former empires or former imperial spaces or current empires, are they always that self-reflective about the violence that they've caused in other spaces? I mean, absolutely not. I mean, you only need to look at our experience in the north of Ireland, for example. There's been decades and decades of trying to find any form of justice and meaningful justice for many people who experienced a lot of loss and a lot of harm as a result of British state violence in the north. And we've also experienced now in the last 25 years of kind of a transition away from our most recent conflict, that the British government has done pretty much all it can to cover up what was going on during the period of time known as the Troubles. So don't really expect empires to have that level of self-reflection. The other one thing I would say with regard to all of those other case studies, if you take Pakistan, India, you take Israel, Palestine, and you take Ireland, there is a common theme as well, which is partition and division and fragmentation. Exactly. So that's something that the British Empire was exceptionally good at, and creating those fault lines physically and then leaving and letting people sort of try and deal with the fallout of that. So I don't really expect these states to have that level of reflection, self-reflection. Yeah.
That was a good warm-up of our brains. And now I have a couple of notes in front of me in regards to you. So you are associate professor and fellow at the Trinity College here in Dublin.
Yeah.
So you divide the time between Belfast and Dublin, or you live here, or how do you do?
No, I live in Belfast, which is great for me because I love Belfast. I'm from Belfast. I was born in Belfast. I have the privilege of running a master's program in the north of Ireland. So Trinity actually has a satellite campus based in Belfast, which is great. And it's one master's program that looks at conflict resolution specifically. We're better to do it than the city of Belfast, right? Going through its own transition. So very much embedded within Trinity College. But I divide my time coming up and down when I get, when I have to.
Yeah, it's in my notes: conflict resolution and forced displacement, settler colonialism, and liberal peace building, which we're gonna talk about, especially relating to Palestine and Northern Ireland. Yeah. So what, in a nutshell, or without making a deep dive, what are the parallels, if there are any, what are the parallels between the Northern Ireland so-called peace process and the peace process? I don't want to make it now specific on the current peace process that Trump initiated, because there have been many and probably there will be more. Yeah? For real, yeah. But the approach here, are there any similarities?
There are some similarities, yeah. The first thing, and looking at it from my perspective, is I'm very interested in, and this might seem a little bit oxymoronic or a little bit confusing, but I'm very interested in the violence of peace. I'm very interested in the way that peace can be used as a tool to silence, used as a tool to marginalize queries and questions around justice, or to stifle legitimate conversations around decolonization or around liberation as a whole. Okay, so I've been fascinated in the context of Northern Ireland, how we have a peace process there. We have a peace process that everybody has bought into for the most part, that offers us an opportunity to live lives that are based on equality, dignity, and respect, regardless of where you're from and your background. But equally, I'm very interested in the way that peace has been used to further colonize the space in Palestine, right? So for Palestinians, the passing of time and the shrinking of the physical space can be mapped directly onto myriad different failed peace processes, right? From Taba, Madrid, Oslo, depends where you go. So with all these different interventions of peace building, you see Palestine shrinking and the notion of Palestine as a state or whatever that looks like in the future getting less and less likely. So they're the things that really fascinate me, but it is also the silencing of perpetrators and the silencing of a justice-oriented future that I'm particularly interested in. And it's built out of, lived experience in the first instance, born in Belfast, born to my father, who was an internally displaced person, was burnt out of his house in the 1970s. One of many that happened to. Growing up in a society that was characterized by unfairness, depending on where you were from and what your background was. So being a child that's born into a conflict, but also being, I would say, a child of a peace process or a child of a transition. And I think that offers me a quite a unique way then to reflect on other spaces. And sometimes I'm asked the question, you know, is that what then leads you to go to Palestine, to sort of look at it from a, I would love to say yes, and it was a deliberate decision, but like everything in life, that's a bit more serendipitous, you know.
I also see you have published at least 4 books. Is it correct? 4?
Yeah.
Yeah. So which one of those do you think had the most impact?
Well, can I just correct? It's that there are 4 books that my name is attached to. So there are 2 that I've been, you know, single authors or co-authors, and then there's edited books, and I think that's important. But all 4 books, yeah. It depends. It's very hard to measure impact. The one that I could rephrase the question.
Yeah, which of those books were you most criticized for? There you can gauge the impact.
I would say the one that always brings the most scrutiny, and I think this is the case for anybody that's worked on Palestine, is the Palestine work. It always brings the most scrutiny, especially because it's quite a deliberately provocative title. It's a enforcing the peace.
That's the title, enforcing the peace. Yeah.
Transitional justice and enforcing the peace.
That's a different one. So enforcing the peace on Palestine. That's the book.
It's transitional justice and enforcing the peace on Palestine. That probably drew a lot of scrutiny. Now, I didn't make a lot of publicity around that book, if I'm being honest, because it came out in 2023 when the situation in Palestine was had ruptured like we've seen in the last couple of years, and perhaps it's that work that's going to become more relevant now as we begin this transition towards whatever that transition is going to look like. And when peace is going to be even more weaponized, which is what we're seeing. So that one I think will become more relevant. The one, Refugees and Forced Displacement, during Northern Ireland's Troubles, was a co-authored book with a guy called Niall Gilmartin, and it was great as well. I think it's done quite well, but certainly the Palestine one will bring the heat for sure.
You just mentioned it, and it's on my list. Transitional justice. So explain the concept, please.
Well, transitional justice, as I theorize it and understand it, is kind of like a quasi-legal science almost of peace building. It's approaches that states that have gone through a conflict and are transitioning from one conflict to an inverted commas period of stability will engage in various processes to try and win the peace. So they will adopt a range of measures that are important to unpack if you're to try and make sure that the peace that you're promoting is going to stick. So people talk about a transitional justice toolkit, a set of measures that people can use. Things like truth recovery, things like institutional reform, memorialization, commemoration, and international criminal justice. Tribunals, etc., etc. So it's this kind of set of tools that have been developed from the mid-90s at a period of time when we were seeing conflicts in the Balkans, conflicts in Latin America, moving from dictatorship to seemingly towards democracies. And these were being said, in order to embed these wins, these peace wins, we need to have justice as a component of that. So that's what transitional justice sort of was and has morphed into this kind of huge thing where people say if you're engaged in a conflict and you've moved into the peace building phase, you now must engage in some kind of transitional justice in order to embed it. So much so that the language of transitional justice is now almost synonymous with peace building. And the language of transitional justice is used by the United Nations, for example. It's become very normalized, hyper-normalized. And I became really fascinated by transitional justice when I was studying law at Queen's in Belfast, because the north of Ireland is a transitional justice laboratory. In many ways, we have experienced attempts at transitional justice from the signing of our peace agreement. So yeah, that's what it tends to do. That's what it is.
So transitional justice, if I understand it correctly, is not true justice, right? It's a means for an end.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's it can mean anything to a lot of different people. It's extremely useful then for people to try and embed their version of what a future looks like, if you get me. So justice for you and me will be two different things. They will not necessarily always, match on to a shared understanding. So yeah, it's a set of mechanisms that fledgling states use to try and embed the peace that they've won, and to hold perpetrators to account, and to try and make sure that victims of gross human rights violations receive some kind of recognition for the harm that they experienced, essentially.
So there are two sides to that, a positive one and a not so positive one.
Exactly. Yeah.
So if we apply this right away to Trump's form of transitional justice in Gaza, so what's your point of view?
Trump's form of transition in Gaza? I mean,
Trump's form of transitional justice.
I don't think it exists. There's no justice component whatsoever in Trump's mythical analysis.
Specifically related to the current peace deal as of what is today, 16th of October.
Yeah. This is absent completely of justice. I mean, this is a 20-point plan of continued colonial control, of continued Western dominance, of complete pacification of the Palestinian people, of an attempt to depoliticize the Palestinian people, of an attempt to demilitarize the Palestinian people, an attempt to turn Gaza into a site of capital production, as opposed to a really important component of whatever any future Palestinian state, whatever you want to conceive of that might look like. The 20-point plan does nothing to center justice at all. It makes some kind of willy-nilly reference to peaceful coexistence in the future. It's just some hypothetical thing, but it doesn't talk at all about holding people to account for perpetrating a genocide. It makes no reference to international criminal justice. It makes no reference to truth recovery about what has happened over the last 2 years. It makes no reference about reparations and repair, right? Beyond actually telling the people around Palestine, the neighboring states, and some slightly further, that they will pay for what happened. So I wouldn't use the term transitional. I would say there's a proposed transition, but it's completely devoid of any sense of justice, 100%. And the biggest injustice in all of that is the complete absence of the Palestinian voice in the conversation, right? So there's not even a tokenistic sense of a Palestinian voice, which is why, people who are very, very close intellectually or scholastically to that space will just dismiss this outright. And it's going to, I would say, and I don't think it's a big stretch to say, but it's going to cause huge challenges moving forward, especially when it's read alongside this other Tony Blair initiative, right? Which I'm sure, and they actually use the word transition. Yep. The Gaza International Transition Authority, right? And they have this kind of very, complex thing, mapping out of what's going to happen, and we're going to appoint these people and this government, and this person's going to be responsible. And again, it's all based on business, entrepreneurs, tech. It's all based on, a vision of Gaza that makes no sense to anybody in Palestine, let me tell you. And it's another example of, it's almost a return to the British mandate in Palestine, right? So it's almost like Balfour has become Blair, and we've circled back around again. So, that even though the word transition's in there, that's just another example of a horrible Western imposed condition on the Palestinian people. It's horrendous.
I published an article called Billionaire Takeover of Gaza at the 2nd of October. That was prior to this so-called peace deal. Yeah. Outlining the relationship between Trump, Blair, and Larry Ellison, co-founder of Oracle, who paid $257 million to the Blair Institute, which allowed Tony Blair to expand his organization into 43 countries. Yeah. And it outlines exactly what you said, that that it is what the title says, a billionaire takeover of Gaza.
Exactly.
And in my point of view, the best case scenario in this plan is for the local Palestinians to become the dishwashers in Trump's envisioned Riviera in the Middle East.
100%, yeah, 100%. And that is exactly the plan. That is why there's such a push towards ethnic cleansing, essentially, of the space. It's, having this clear run to build this horrible bastard vision of what they're putting forward, devoid of any pesky Palestinian resistance that would hold them back. And it's only because of the determination of the strength of the Palestinian people, and those images of the Palestinian people returning, 400,000, 500,000 marching north. These are absolutely powerful images, and alongside the strength and determination of the resistance, which after 2 years remains able and intact to exert some kind of control, whatever way you want to refer to the control, it still exists. The Israelis didn't achieve their war goals. Their stated aims were to obliterate the resistance. That has obviously not happened. So even before it starts to get off the table, you can see that this transitional idea is going to be a complete failure.
Yeah. So you already preempted my next, admittedly very binary question, which would have been: do you think this peace plan, this current peace plan, has any chance of succeeding?
Zero. And I don't say that flippantly, because we know that people on the ground need some kind of sense of something better than the place is absolutely destroyed, as you know, and so I'm not saying it to be dismissive. I'm saying that if anybody understands the history of Palestine, knows that any imposition from outside, any attempt at complete Zionist takeover, any attempt at Western takeover will always be met with resistance. It's written into the al-Tawabet of the Palestinian people. It's written into the mindset. There will always be resistance. Oppression breeds resistance, and it's not only the case in Palestine. We've seen this in other anti-colonial struggles. We've seen this in other spaces the world over. So I think any imposition, as is being proposed at this moment in time, will be met by resistance of some description. And it's only a matter of time until you have another serious flare or explosion the way we've seen, and hopefully people recognize that. But again, it's very difficult. Thomas, right? It's very difficult in this moment to predict when you are working with people like Donald Trump as the person who is the sort of supremo overseer of this process, a man who moves with the wind in terms of opinion, says one thing, does the other. So it's very difficult to make any long-term predictions. But it feels like it's doomed to fail.
Trump, yes, kind of supreme leader, but they want to install Tony Blair as kind of the supreme leader of this whole Gaza, with also really extended authority. Then Larry Ellison, of course, I said already, spent I don't know how much money into Tony Blair's organization. So for a tainted person like Tony Blair, I mean, I'm surprised and actually amazed that he kind of is resurrected here with the help of some billionaires. And Larry Ellison is not the only billionaire in that whole scenario. So from Tony Blair's perspective, given his history, what as far as you can tell, because I haven't seen any kind of mentioning in this 21-point peace plan what they're planning to do with the Palestinians.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So
No, exactly. And you have this kind of almost flippant, the Palestinians won't need to leave when we implement this process. I mean, the fine, okay, but they were never going to leave anyway. They made that very clear. I mean, Tony Blair, I've read some analysis about why he would want to do this or what is the rationale. I mean, Tony Blair, many people obviously see him as being partly, if not wholly, responsible for widespread slaughter in Iraq, civilian loss of life, and in Afghanistan as well. He has a lot of demons, let's say, a lot of skeletons,
on his hands.
Blood on his hands, right? And so, I don't even know what the man is thinking. Is this an opportunity he sees to kind of at redemption or something? Is that what this is being viewed like? I have absolutely no idea. He was also involved, as we know, in the quartet, this quartet that was set up to try and re-energize an already failed and flawed process in Oslo. So he has some kind of let's say connection to the region already, and perhaps that is what pushed him to the top of the pile for this role. But it's disgraceful, and it will also ultimately fail, you know. And people have come out, very senior members of political representatives in Palestine have already come out and said this man has absolutely no reputation of worth amongst the Palestinian people, so he's already a discredited actor. And that's, so good luck to him, you know, it's not going to happen.
I already mentioned Larry Ellison.
Yeah.
Now, I think it was UK Declassified, and I used it yesterday, as you know, a presentation in Cork. And part of my presentation was dealing with the apparent vetting of Marco Rubio by Larry Ellison for his kind of leanings vis-a-vis Israel. And we know that from leaked emails published by UK Declassified, I think. Yeah. So we are talking about supreme leaders, Trump, Blair, but who is really pulling the strings in the background if we see that private entities, private persons basically, with a lot of money, are virtually vetting who is being suitable for Americans' highest, not the highest, but highest offices. So who is really pulling the strings?
100%. But we've known that AIPAC plays a major role in American politics. We know this. And, you know, there's one thing that's interesting about Trump, right? There's one thing that's interesting. And I actually speak to some of my Palestinian colleagues and comrades about this. They say they'd far rather deal with somebody like Trump, believe it or not, than somebody like Obama or somebody like Biden or whatever, because Trump just says it. He doesn't even try to hide it. So when he was addressing the Knesset recently, he was addressing the fact that the amount of money that was being pumped into the White House by the Edelson family. Miriam Edelson was in the audience,
100 million,
and he was directing his commentary to her and the family. He referenced the fact that she was always in the White House, you know. So the thing about Trump is he has no filter. He just spills all the secrets, right? But it's not just him, as you rightly pointed out. This goes so much deeper within the American political operation, right? And you get all of these kind of these exposés to see how many American senators and whatever have their campaigns funded by AIPAC. I mean, people like Ted Cruz, again, hugely propped up by AIPAC. People like Rubio, but again, even lower level senators, it's the same. And they push this agenda through the United States, and that's what's happening. And that's not conspiratorial. This is all become very mainstream knowledge now, you know. And I think that's one thing in the last 2 years that we've seen, aside from the horrendous carnage and everything else, we've seen just how embedded the special relationship is between the Americans and between the Israelis. We knew it existed. Chomsky talked about it in his book, Fateful Triangle. We knew this existed for decades, but it's been very, very exposed. Even the comment, for example, that Trump said, Netanyahu rang me and asked me for weapons, and I didn't even know we had those weapons, and I just gave them to him. And like, who would ever say that as American president? It's absolutely absurd. But yeah, so that's what's happening.
There was another scandal, and this is just on top of my head. There's another scandal that blew recently up. Is the project. That means Israel paid up to $150,000 a month to really global influencers with a lot of followers, millions and up. Yeah? It just blew, and I had a look at this, and the level of sophistication in trying to hide the fact that they are paying You had 2 Israeli ministries. Here you had the influencers, and in the middle you had 6 or 7 different entities through which the money was flowing in order to hide the fact that Israel is paying those influencers, which are basically providing or spreading fake news, so to speak. Yeah.
Hasbara, that's it. Yes. Spreading the image of Israel as the victim, spreading the image of Israel as this place, this utopia, this whatever. Anybody that's ever spent any time there would actually maybe push back. Yeah, I mean, we're seeing this all over social media at the moment, for example, on Twitter, on X or whatever, people talking about $7,000, $7,000 is the figure that they're quoting
for one
post, yes. Right? Yes. And actually, so I hate social media, right? It's a pain. It feels like a necessary evil at the moment in a world of misinformation, mainstream misinformation. You know, social media obviously played a key role when it came to documentation of what was going on, right? So
which is why the TikTok
exactly
take over.
Exactly, yeah. Right? So I balance it a little bit, but you were beginning to see even the coordinated response and the same messages coming out from the same influencers on X. Whenever the ceasefire was announced, the same language is being used by the same people, and everybody can just see it for what it is now. You know, it's just a coordinated campaign, and you're going to get a lot more of that. And you're beginning to see it happening now. How is it that we can see very genuinely the people who were responsible for sponsoring the genocide in Gaza, for providing the weapons, the political cover, everything else, are now to be viewed as the peacemakers and the peace builders? That awful sham display of whatever the hell it was in Sharm el-Sheikh, and we're being expected to believe that they are the peacemakers. And this is the process that you're going to begin to see, this inoculation, this rolling back, this attempt to sort of reintegrate the Israeli image into the mainstream again. And that is going to be essential for the Israelis to sort of try and build back, because the world opinion is different.
It's shifting.
It's hugely shifting. And you'll see that in America. I mean, specifically, there's a very, very awakened, let's say, and a growing number of young American Jewish young people saying, like, I don't want to be associated with the Israeli state. I don't want to be associated with that. And questioning things in a way that perhaps they weren't prepared to question 5 years ago or 10 years ago. Yeah. Saying things like, birthright? What's that about? Why should I be doing that? And so I do think the opinion is shifting, and that's why you get the very, very active response from these tech companies, from these influencers, from the Hasbara units and the machine.
Larry Ellison, again, is the head of the conglomerate that took over TikTok. Larry Ellison is also the co-founder of Oracle, and one of the biggest contractors of Oracle is the Pentagon.
There you go.
So now Larry Ellison has the data of all Americans using TikTok, which are about 170 million. I couldn't believe when I heard this number first. I did not know that so many Americans are on TikTok. 170 million. So he has that data, behavioral data, yeah, and at the same time they are working together with the Pentagon. That's one thing.
That's crazy.
That's one thing. It gets better. Now Larry Ellison's son David just merged 2 media companies and has now the biggest media conglomerate in the US, inclusive PBS, for example, and others. It's a whole string. I spoke about this yesterday on my presentation. So you have this unprecedented power in one family, from the data of the Americans, right, to the information. So first of all, they can control what Americans think and do, and on the other side, they can control what information the Americans get from, I don't know, 20, 30 different media companies, which are now all under 41-year-old David Ellison. So this kind of consolidation of power and money doesn't make me very confident in regards to what's happening. But coming back to what you just said, I think this is a consequence of Israel losing the war of images.
For sure. Unquestionably.
They're getting more and more desperate.
Unquestionably. And it's for many reasons, right? It's also the strength of the message, and the BDS movement, for example, has been incredibly strong in the last couple of years. People sort of directly drawing linkages between capital, between consumerism, between sports washing, between our university sectors and the Israeli war machine and the state and what it's doing to the Palestinian people. And when people finally got a sense that these things were interlinked and connected, you know, that's what really gave the BDS movement a major boost. Yeah, and also, you know, as we said at the beginning, it was the bravery of the Palestinian people on the ground in Gaza during the genocide, documenting this, putting it on TikTok and Instagram story, and all of a sudden I know when people talk about it being live streamed, it was literally coming in to everybody's pocket. You no longer had to go searching for it. It was no longer being curated to you through a third party. It was not a foreign correspondent journalist reporting on it, putting a slant on it, and then presenting it in a certain way. All of a sudden you get people directly showing it, and you can't argue with that.
You have the Palestinian version here.
For real.
And interestingly, Al Jazeera has identified 2,000 accounts, not posts, 2,000 social media accounts from Israelis committing war crimes and filming themselves. Sure. Now, I'm always saying the Germans were so convinced that they win the war that they documented everything. Some of them got hung because of that evidence. Now we see Israelis doing exactly the same.
You do, and what you're also beginning to see, and to link it back to the point you're making about control of social media and control of data, is you're beginning to see major social media platforms now deleting content, removing content off servers. So all of a sudden the documentation that was being done during the genocide, right, all of that really important work is now at risk. People are trying to erase it off the internet as quickly as possible.
Yeah, that's only partially possible. There are time machines on the internet. I make it very black and white, so you go back in time and still extract content.
Well, that's great for us, right? Because that is also linked, I think. You know, if you want to imagine a justice-oriented future, you want to imagine that, all of that stuff is evidence that has to be presented in some shape or form, right? But the question that I would put back on that is, what are we going to do with that evidence? Is it going to be simply the case that we present it and say this is what happened? Because that's what a lot of transitional justice approaches do. They link it back to transitional justice. They gather all the evidence, they document all the evidence, and they provide platform to show it, but it's not always the link to repair or reparations or, you know, or punishment, retribution, criminality and things like that. So it can't just be the case that we allow this documentation just to be put into a genocide museum 5 years from now. It has to be linked to accountability. And that accountability is, of course, those IDF soldiers that were involved and the state and whoever pressed the button and whoever signed off. But the accountability goes much further than that. It goes to America. It also goes to the European Union. There's plenty of voices in the European Union at a very high level who provided the cover for this. And that, I think, you know, is sometimes where transitional justice provides a liberal opportunity to be seen to be doing something, when in actual fact you're doing nothing really. You're just presenting evidence without any outcome. And that's what I would be concerned about, what might happen in the future with all of this. I mean, you go back to the work of Ilan Pappé and whatever, and documentation of Tantura, the massacre that happened in Tantura. They were able, Israeli filmmakers or documentarians were able to talk about the Tantura massacre and talk very clearly about what happened in explicit detail.
No question.
With no sense that anybody would ever be held to account. Such was the complacency and the arrogance with which the Israeli state held itself and holds itself. They felt we could just be open and honest, inverted commas, open and honest about what happened, because we know nothing's going to happen. That's it.
Because you mentioned Tantura, I interviewed 2 actual survivors of Tantura. One was an old lady in Amman, 94 years old, and another gentleman in Germany. So I went to 2 places. Incidentally, both of them died within the last 2 months.
Wow.
But I have the story from 2 different sides. Yeah. Okay. What really stuck with me was, and I need to give you a little bit of context. Sure, yeah, 1 or 2 minutes.
Yeah, of course.
So there is an American-Palestine filmmaker called Hala Gabriel, And she is a family member of those two survivors of Tantura. They were not just survivors of Tantura, they owned a large part of Tantura, and their uncle was mayor of Tantura. And incidentally, the very last ruin of house of that period is still standing on the beach. Now this old gentleman in Germany, when I was there, after the interview, I showed him his niece, because she's working on a documentary about Tantura, sitting on the ruins of this house. And I was respectless enough to film that. And I can tell you one thing, time does not heal all wounds.
Definitely not.
This old gentleman was there sitting and crying in silence, just seeing his niece, who he never saw, sitting on the ruins of their family home. Yeah, it was incredibly moving. And he told me stories. I have not published that. I have published the interview of the female survivor, but not from the male survivor, because it talked about things that I'm not sure yet I can publish on YouTube. Yeah. One detail, I interviewed the daughter of a participant, of a Israeli perpetrator of Tantura. And it's just published a month ago. It has now 120,000 views. So for my little channel, that's quite some, it's quite some stuff. And she found out via, there's this documentary from Ellen Schwartz, Tantura, where this old former Haganah Irgun fighters smiling and laughing say, yeah, we raped them, we burnt them, we killed them, it was all fun. Yeah. So based on that documentary, and that's where Elon Pape comes in, his Teddy Cuts, he interviewed the original ones, and this daughter identified her father based on these recordings. Yeah, it's incredible, an incredible story. And Gideon Levy has his name Gideon on the fallen soldier, which was a friend of her father's. And her brother is also named after that, is also called Gideon. I mean, how...
It's unbelievable. Yeah. It's so interlinked, right? It's so intermeshed. And even that notion that you said about the passing of time and not healing all the wounds and the trauma, and a lot of that is the absence of any sort of meaningful justice.
It never stops.
It never stops. Yeah. It never stops. It never stops. And when we were living in Bethlehem when I worked at the Al-Quds University in 2015, we lived in the house of a Palestinian Nakba survivor, wonderful woman called Odette Hasbon. And she lived in the top floor and we lived in the bottom floor. And like is very common in a lot of Palestinian families, she had the key, the original key to her family home in Jaffa, right? So her father was involved in the orange exporting business in Jaffa. And when the Nakba happened, they lost everything. And they ended up as refugees living in Bethlehem. And she talked very openly about the impact that rupture had on their family. People ended up living abroad, never being able to return meaningfully, and the trauma and that. And she had never been able to return back to Jaffa. She was now living in Bethlehem behind the wall. And
they all see now what's going on right now. Yeah, in many respects, what happens now is even worse than what happened then.
100%, 100%. Because, just imagine, people talking about ceasefire and going home.
Where to?
Where to? Where to? 80% of all the civilian homes are gone.
Systematically bombed.
Erased. Yeah. That was the plan, right? That was the plan. The plan was
Greater Israel, like on the army soldiers' uniform.
Exactly, but they never hit it. But the other thing as well is they talked openly about the plan. So not only were they documenting the plan, as we've said, they talked openly about what they were going to do. This is the level of confidence and arrogance.
Like the Germans, that's what I'm saying. They had the same confidence and arrogance, and see what they brought them.
But I often wonder what is it that leads to that level of arrogance, and there's lots of different reasons, right? But one of the reasons is this complete sureness, or this complete this idea that nobody's going to stop us. Because history has shown for the past 77 years, we can do whatever we want. We can do it fast. We can do it incrementally. We can build another little settlement, or we can do an outpost, or we can make it bigger. We can join up the road system. Nobody's going to stop us, because this shows also, and again, just to bring it back into the legalistic conversation, it exposes the limitations of international criminal justice and international criminal law. So we might say that we have all of these legal doctrines, and we have all of these things that you're supposedly not allowed to do, or you're supposedly prevent you from annexing or doing whatever. But the reality is, without any enforcement, it's pretty worthless. 2004, the International Court of Justice declares that the Israeli wall is illegal. The apartheid wall is illegal. In 2004, in 2025, the wall is much bigger than what it was in 2004. So a determination that was made by an advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice in 2004 did literally nothing to stop the complete annexation, essentially, of the West Bank. And that's it. So it's not a million miles away to join those two logics, right? You know, the Israelis felt very clearly in the last 2 years they could do whatever they want, therefore they said whatever they want. And they documented whatever they want, because history showed nobody's going to stop them.
Is there not a trend to undermine international institutions, like the UN, for example?
What's the trend? Who, from people like me?
No. From people like Trump and Netanyahu, you know. I mean, even institutions like the UN, who were instrumental in the creation of the State of Israel, are not being attacked but systematically undermined for the benefit of Israel. But so is international law, so is the ICJ, and so is the ICC.
100%.
So where do we go with this? On a more global context, if international law erodes, if the global order crumbles, where does this lead us?
Well, you're saying if. I'm saying it has.
It does. Yeah.
I think it has. I think a lot of people are still very nervous about reaching that conclusion, and for good reason. And the reason that I think they're nervous about reaching that conclusion is they don't know where we go next. But we are and people were talking about this being a rupture moment about maybe a year and a half ago. People were saying, look, every norm is being ripped up in front of us. Every hospital that's being bombed on the pretext of nonsense, you know, it shows that international law is being ripped up in front of us, etc., etc. So we are at that moment, and every veto that happens at the UN Security Council, despite the fact that the UN General Assembly called for a ceasefire within 10 days of the 7th of October, right? As early on as that, people were talking about the need for a ceasefire. So I really don't know where we go from this. I think we need a fundamental reset. I think what I would say is that debate is happening. Critical international lawyers are talking about this, whether or not international law is now dead, essentially. There are still those within networks that I'd be a part of as well who say, look, we understand that international law is deeply flawed, but we need to pivot within the system to try and make the wins and trying to make the arguments. And there's some brilliant critical international lawyers who do that. You know, this Palestinian international lawyers have been doing this for decades because they've tried to operate within the system to make the gains. But this has really shattered everything. And it feels at times that there's a cop-out from people like me because I don't know what the future looks like. I don't know how to reform this. I don't know if we need to have a fundamental reevaluation of what the Security Council looks like. I mean, the Security Council, the UN, is also the product of a post-World War, Second World War world. And there's been a lot of water under the bridge since the Second World War. Do you know what I mean? And like the world has shifted on its axis a few times in terms of power relationships and dynamics. So the notion that you would even have permanent members of a Security Council with veto powers is inherently based within a colonial mindset, right? Within a Western imperial mindset that is, as you said, functioning out of the ashes of the Second World War. That's not to say that it wasn't required. I'm not saying that it wasn't required after the Second World War. Perhaps it was, but institutions need to reevaluate and need to look at themselves and rebuild. But what that looks like, you tell me. I've no idea.
Before, I would like to discuss the NGO military continuum, which I know that you have spoken and written about. But before I do it, there's a question on my mind. You are also quite outspoken. Have you personally faced some backlash or unintended consequences? Or
yes.
I mean, you wouldn't be the first academic on my show, if I can call it like that, who really has suffered the consequences.
I would be the first. Or not? No.
Definitely not.
Definitely not. No, flip me. I know half of them. No. Yeah, I've definitely had a pushback for sure. I mean, there's specific examples which I'm happy to talk about. I've received harassment on numerous levels online. I've received harassment from political representatives on the island of Ireland directly. I've received direct harassment to my email addresses, to LinkedIn, to X accounts and whatever. I consider that almost par for the course. So anytime I post it, I just turn comments off. I have no interest in engaging with that. But I've also experienced like deplatforming or cancellation, having an invitation revoked on one occasion. So I was invited, I'll give you an example. I was invited to speak as part of a group of scholars talking about transitional justice and its limitations, on its strengths, its possibilities. One of those conferences, that's what academics do, or it was a closed workshop. And then I had that invitation revoked by somebody who was a professor in the school who was organizing it in Vienna, who revoked it. And that was incredible. I found that absolutely incredible. And I've talked about that publicly before. I published a piece on Dawn Media about that before. I've spoken about it on a number of occasions. But such is the extent to which criticism of the Israeli state produces backlashes, even within the supposed liberal bastion of free speech, which is allegedly the academy. You get this level of shutdown, and you get it, I think, you get it in various different strengths, certainly in Germany, Austria, Switzerland. I've heard lots of stories. Netherlands, exactly. UK, we're getting it. There's the suppression and the silencing on Palestine and solidarity, including in the academy, has only got more and more extreme in the last 2 years. So yeah, and there's a whole, as you say, it's happened to so many of us. And I don't, when you say I'm outspoken, I don't think anything I'm saying is controversial. I think I don't think it's controversial. I think it takes a sort of a determination to say it, fine, but I don't think it's controversial.
In terms of facts, in terms of the science, in terms of research, it's not controversial. But for certain interest groups, it's definitely controversial.
100%. Yeah, I get that. Yeah, I get that. And it's all designed to, as everything almost that we've talked about here, it's all designed to maintain the interests of the Israeli state, to maintain beyond just the Israeli state, to maintain the status quo, the order as we know it, to the Western hegemony, to ensure that this is the way things are, and we don't want rabble rousing, or we don't want anything that disrupts that. Not that I could, what am I do? What could I possibly do to disrupt? But
yeah. Western hegemony. Yeah. So we are at in a recent interview, I said we are at the tail end of 500 years of Western domination. I was correctly so. It's about 600 years Western domination. There was the enlightenment, etc. in it. The world is changing. The American empire is sinking. The Asian forces, empires, whatever, are rising. So you said it already, also there was a lot of water under the bridge since the UN was created after the Second World War. Now, in order to maintain the hegemonic powers of the West as long as possible, things like the NGO military continuum come into play. It's one of many means. Yeah, and I know you wrote about it. So tell us what you mean by it.
Sure. Did I use the terminology military continuum? I'm not sure I did.
Okay, but it's fitting, right?
I think so. Yeah, I think I could probably reflect a little bit on the role that NGOs play in the Palestine context. I think, what you see in the immediate aftermath of Oslo, for example, in 1993, is this kind of proliferation, this NGOization of the West Bank, of Gaza, of the
Basically
space.
outsourcing.
Outsourcing.
And delegating.
Exactly.
Also responsibility.
100% outsourcing and delegating and pacifying. Just keeping everybody in their spaces.
Maybe you define pacifying. You said it now the second time. It has such a nice ring to it. Pacify, it's kind of with peace, and so. But define pacifying.
Well, how I understand it would be sort of trying to almost make sure that the notion of self-determination or liberation, these words that cause such consternation in the West, cause such consternation amongst colonial powers, because they don't want colonized people to agitate for liberation or self-determination. They want them to go about and enjoy human rights or enjoy equality in a different way, and it's all outsourced, as you said, through these NGOs, and that's how I understand pacification in this context. And that's what you see if you spend any time in the West Bank. You do see a lot of these organizations that have been pumped with international money and resources to try and just keep people in the sort of in the spaces that they find themselves in, and not actually agitate for more or something bigger. And actually we see that in other contexts as well. But what I do think is you're going to see a lot more of that in an increasingly shrinking space of the West Bank. You're going to see more and more money being pumped in, but the space itself in which those NGOs will operate will be smaller and smaller and smaller. And that's how I understand that condition.
Would it be fair to say, and again, I know I make it very black and white, so you completely eradicate Gaza, you bomb every single building and you kill every single Palestinian in Gaza. That's also pacifying.
Well, that's annihilating.
It's also pacifying.
Well, probably, yeah. I mean, it's another way to do it, I guess. Yeah.
What I want to go with this is, as a linguist, as a behavior analyst, I'm mindful of language.
Sure.
So if NGOs or military or political leaders use the term pacifying, again, it has a kind of peaceful ring to it, but that's not necessarily what they mean. Pacifying can be a brutal suppression is also pacifying.
100%.
You pacify the population. They're no longer there to resist, or they no longer exist. It's also pacifying.
I agree with you. Yeah, I think that's quite a sophisticated way to join the dots, and I think that's really important because they are on extremes. They're on opposite levels of action, let's say, but they're also working towards the same end goal. Right? Maybe one's doing it in a very extreme way, which is in the case of the genocide. The other, I think, and I would argue, is that the NGOization of the space is stifling, is delegitimizing or attempting to delegitimize the legitimate aims and goals of the Palestinian people, which is towards self-determination, towards liberation, towards an end of the occupation. And I think your linking of that in one continuum, I think, is important and sophisticated.
Lawfare of reconstruction. That's on my list because I mean, first of all, lawfare, and then in combination with the reconstruction, and coming back again to what we already scratched on, basically a privatized billionaire clique taking over Gaza. So they cannot just do it. They need the laws in order to allow them to do so. At least that would we assume, taking into consideration that international law and the global order kind of crumbles anyway. So lawfare of reconstruction. Law itself can enforce occupation, and this is a topic that you have addressed.
Yeah. I'm trying to understand what your question is specifically. I think
you have shown that law itself can enforce occupation. That
Sure.
means, in retrospect, they kind of bend the laws in order to make it legal what actually is illegal.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, 100%. And so the point is that how do you understand the reconstruction side of that? I'm trying to understand where that fits.
Reconstruction in the context of billionaire takeover of Gaza, which it de facto is.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's proposed. That's what was being proposed. Yeah. And the point that the point, as I understand it, then, is that there will be everything they do will be framed within a legalistic language that makes it seem desirable, or indeed obviously legal. Exactly. And again, it goes back to that point about the limitations of international law when it comes to relying upon it to achieve your aims of self-determination and liberation. I mean, but again, the counter argument to that would be, can you operate within that system to try and to achieve your goals? And that's where the critical international lawyers will probably say yes. But I'm at the limits of my understanding of that language, to be honest.
There are people, so some people like to compare, let's say, the apartheid in the occupied territories with the apartheid in South Africa. Now there's one fundamental flaw. The South Africans, the occupiers, how shall we say them, they didn't want to kill the black population, they wanted to exploit them. Now if you look at Palestine, it's the opposite. So they don't want to exploit them, they want to get rid of them, 100%. One way or another. Yeah.
So much so, by the way, so much so that there were South African lawmakers or South African former activists, when people draw the comparison between the two, actually said, well, no, what's going on in Palestine is so much worse.
Nelson Mandela said it himself.
Nelson Mandela said it himself, right? And it's this idea about settler colonialism. The idea of settler colonialism is erasing to replace, all right? The idea is to erase the Palestinians from the land to be replaced by settlers coming in. That wasn't, as you rightly pointed out, the aim in South Africa under the apartheid regime. So I think in that sort of framing, it's interesting that the language of apartheid, which did become quite popular, let's say, in the context of Palestine, but 4 or 5 years ago, you got several reports being published to say this is apartheid or whatever else. You're now beginning to find some of these international human rights organizations, some of these lawyers saying we need to move beyond the language of apartheid. It's much worse than that. It's so much more pernicious. This is about erasure, and that's why the language of genocide has been so important in this moment, to make sure that it's been mainstreamed. For sure. Yeah.
There was a Amnesty International report not so long ago. It's called Automated Apartheid. Where they talked about the cameras, which also have the guns, and the AI systems in the background, Wolfpack Blue and Wolfpack Red, which I find ironic because the Germans called the U-boat swarms that they have to attack the Allied convoys Wolfpacks. Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I find that really troubling. The thing about, and just bringing it back to Gaza in the last 2 years as well, what we've also seen is Gaza as this complete space of experimentation and technological experimentation.
Battle-tested weapons.
Battle-tested. I mean, these drones, quadricopters going in and hitting people remotely. It's been absolutely incredible. And that's also being tested in the West Bank at this moment in time. And I think it's very important when we're having these conversations is to ensure that we link all of these spaces together. The fragmentation is an issue, so we need to make sure that it's just on different speeds, I guess, at this moment in time. But I can't imagine.
There's a growing interdependence between, one step back. So people say, okay, we should not sell Israel weapons anymore. Right? Selling is anyway relative because at the end it's the US taxpayer paying for those sales. Yeah? My argument would be, we should stop buying weapons from Israel, and weapons that we sell to Israel are different type of weapons than we buy from Israel, because the weapons that we buy from Israel are mostly high-tech, AI-related, software-related, these kind of weapons, right? Now, unfortunately, we live in a world where more and more governments militarize their own police force, but not only physical, but also with the weapons of surveillance, for example, that are again, and facial recognition and the AI models behind them, encryption and the breaking of encryption and these kind of things. And this is what, there's a growing trend of dictatorial but not so dictatorial regimes to get those weapons. Yeah, even in moderate European countries, you already find this type of weapons. Now, what does that tell us about the future? I mean, one last thing. If people think, this is in Gaza, it's far away, and yeah, we know there are troubles. Wait and see, because what you see now, this selling of those battle-tested weapons, why do you think governments buy them?
100%.
These are specific weapons for population control. This is the expertise of Israel. Now, where do you think those weapons of population control be deployed? By your neighbor? I mean, your neighboring country? By your whatever enemy you think you have? No, this is for your own population. Keyword, NATO's cognitive warfare program.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a really, really important point, because what this has also shown us in the last 2 years is the disposability of certain populations as well. Certain people will just be considered gone, and you're no longer of use to us. And governments, we have also seen, are not very responding to our demands, because every nation or every capital city almost across Europe has been on the streets demanding that their government change direction. And as you said, that level of surveillance and it being so embedded within big tech as well is why you have all of the relationships that you made reference to at the beginning. That's why these are so critically joined up together. And there's another point I would just want to put on top of this, is that the intellectual energy and the sort of how these things are developed and designed is also through the academy. Let's be clear about this, right? And that also leads us back then to the demand for people to call for boycott of academic spaces, to ensure that we don't provide governments with the technological advancements to be able to do exactly what you're talking about. The facial recognition technology that is being tried out and being deployed everywhere, that was based on research that was being done in Belfast, in Queens. To the best of my knowledge, that's where that was happening. Certainly and then that technology was then being used at checkpoints in the West Bank. Again, highlighting how these things are all interlinked. And that level of population management and surveillance is going to be a feature of everything moving forward. Yeah, exactly.
Digital IDs. Coming hard and fast. CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, another form of absolute 100% control. Digital IDs, coming back, I was too fast now. Digital IDs means you link your real world identity to anything and everything you do online and offline. But there is also then a duty on us as citizens and civilians to push back a bit, because everything we do now, we have almost willingly given our entire profile over to these companies and to the government. We walk around with a digital ID in our pockets. We give, we will use search engines because they're convenient and not use other things. And most people, right? I'm not saying everybody. Some people are more savvy than others when it comes to that. So we've almost done the hard work for the governments. And we'll have to, that's the other thing we'll have to think about, is how do we then wean ourselves off this, right? So whenever people were talking about boycott, divestment and sanctions and the critical need for it, and people were reducing everything to boycott McDonald's, or you don't go to Starbucks, or don't buy Hewlett-Packard, we actually needed to have a far more detailed, critical conversation about our relationship with tech, with Microsoft, with Google, with Meta, what information we were handing over, all this digital platform that was just that made our life more convenient, or what we thought was more convenient, essentially is going to come back and control us. It's the behavioral data that we have provided so willingly. And they're already so advanced. So again, TikTok having, so Oracle now having the behavioral data of 170 million Americans, which allows them to predict, not only to manipulate, but also to predict. Now they talk already about predictive justice. Means you could be kind of flagged, maybe even arrested, based on the fact that they think you might do something, based on the behavior that you have shown in the past online. Yeah, but this is not the type of digital ID that I was referring to. So Keir Starmer was talking about like 2 weeks ago. I heard him. Everyone will have to have a digital ID, a linked. So your online behavior will be linked. No. Internet access based on a digital ID, and the digital ID is linked to your actual persona.
Yeah.
And you will then have this digital ID in your pocket, like we had. I don't know if you guys had it, but during Corona time, we had this kind of app. I had to show everywhere, blah blah blah. It was also linked. It was already kind of digital ID. Yeah. But that means anything you do online, anything whatsoever, any protest, any communication, any payment, any whatever. Yeah, digital ID. And not only online, because you go to an airport, you buy a train ticket, you buy I don't know what, digital ID. This is always linked together with CBDCs, central bank digital currency, which is the financial version of this kind of digital glasshouse, which gives 100% control to the banks and the governments. They can see anything, and they can say CBDCs, you can spend this money in the next 3 months. If you don't, it's gone, and you can spend it here and not there. And if you do this, you get more, and if you do this, you don't get any. Yeah. And then they need because there are already experiments running in a number of countries, then they need a shock in order to scare people enough to accept them. Yeah. So in your perspective, what could the shock be?
I don't know, because you're educating me on this at the moment, right? Yeah, so I don't want to give you a bullshit answer around that, but I mean, what you're telling me is utterly terrifying, and I know it exists, and I know it's coming, but the shock, I mean, what do you think the shock's going to be?
There are two types of shocks, ones which are purposefully instigated and ones that happen naturally. But both shocks, it doesn't matter, both shocks can be used for, never waste a good catastrophe. Never use,
this is
never
very
waste.
Naomi Klein, shock doctrine, right?
Shock doctrine.
Yeah.
She's right.
I think she probably
She's right.
is.
Yeah.
I think she probably is. And I think COVID, by the way, was an opportunity to do all of what you're saying in terms of enhancing surveillance.
The playbook is already there.
It's there. And I think, actually, if you listen to some of the critical voices back during COVID, people were saying, we're going to have a major war in Europe as a result of this. We're going to have a major escalation in the Middle East as a result. I don't know. Hypothetically, were they speculating with?
I don't know if there's a link, but what struck me was this kind of global implementation, which happened pretty fast.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
So. That might be a playbook for what's to come, but again, this is the realm of speculation.
And I'm outside of my comfort zone with that. The only thing I would say about, and just by the by, tangential, when Keir Starmer talks about the ID, right, he's rehashing, by the way, a failed Labour policy, or an attempt to bring this in years ago, and in Belfast, this has created all sorts of conversation, right? Because people in the north of Ireland, right, some people in the north of Ireland will absolutely never own a British identity card, even though we're technically in the United Kingdom as governments-wise. So there's going to be a clashing of heads there. I mean, I don't have a British passport, for example. I have an Irish passport, even though I'm based in Belfast. So people in parts of the city in Belfast are saying, "Fuck, I'm never going to have this," which would be. Interesting. I think he'll get more pushback on that than you think.
Out of personal interest, maybe we talk a little bit about Northern Ireland. So you are coming from Belfast. That's Northern Ireland.
It's the north.
Which is not in the EU. It's under British rule, and we are sitting here in Dublin, which is about 2-3 hours from.
2 hours in the train. Yeah.
Which is in Ireland, but not in the EU. So which is why they are using. Euros here, and you're using pounds in Northern Ireland.
Exactly,
yeah? Now, I have seen movies when I was young about the Northern Ireland conflict, where always the British were the heroes and the Northern Irish, they were the terrorists.
Right.
Like same as we see now with the Palestinians.
Sure.
It's also framing.
Could, 100%.
A Palestinian terrorist, my whole life. Yeah. But with the Northern Irish conflict, it was a similar thing.
Yeah.
So how was this actually kind of resolved, and could we learn something from it vis-a-vis Israel and Palestine?
It's interesting because that's something that a lot of people are talking about now. They're saying if you can resolve, inverted commas, the conflict in the north of Ireland, which they draw similarities, poorly by the way, inaccurately, then perhaps there's an opportunity. I think the first thing to say about the conflict in the north involved multiple actors, right? It's very convenient for the British.
So in Israel and Palestine,
for sure,
multiple actors.
But you know, the British state was an active actor in the north. They often try to remove that side of it and try to make it look like it was a conflict between Catholics and Protestants, two warring factions that just couldn't get on, right? To try to make it a tribalistic thing.
But that's still going on. Sorry,
sure.
I still, not so long ago, I saw there's this celebration day where either the Protestants walk through the neighborhood of the Catholics or the other way around. I'm sorry about my ignorance here.
No, it's fine.
And it's every time it's a big thing and clashes and police. And
So
this is still not solved.
Well, it depends. It depends how you. I mean, it depends how you. Okay, let's bring it back. It depends how you understand solved. Okay, so we had a internationally sponsored, internationally supported peace agreement in 1998, known as the Good Friday or Belfast Agreement. Okay, in 1998. Good Friday, 1998. Now that agreement essentially said that there was an opportunity for to bring an end to political violence, to bring an end to armed struggle, and there was a demand and a desire to have a thing, power sharing or consociationism, power sharing between two communities in the north to make decisions for themselves and not have the British government make decisions. And we had a devolved assembly that was set up and whatever else, right? And that peace agreement was very critical to bringing us away from the kind of day-to-day tit-for-tat sectarian violence that existed, right? So what we have now in the post-1998 era is an environment that is almost completely devoid of bombs, of bullets, of killing. Which there were plenty. There was over 3,500 people were killed during the conflict in the north of Ireland from 1969 to 1998. You know, a lot of people were impacted. Almost 1 in 3 people will have known somebody who died or experienced loss themselves, or will have experienced a conflict-related incident. So the level of infiltration of the conflict was very significant, and then people were burnt out of their homes, infrastructure was damaged, etc. So the peace agreement that comes into play in the north of Ireland is supported by all sides because, and for many different reasons. One, the British realised that there was no way that they were going to defeat the IRA militarily. That's the first thing. Second thing, the IRA knew that there was a stalemate. They weren't going to be able to achieve their goals through armed struggle. Yeah. And then loyalist paramilitaries knew that there was no pathway to eradicating the IRA and maintaining the situation as it was. So that stalemate was important. Do you know what I mean? There was a sense that we need to do something different. There was a political pathway that had been shown to exist. There was a demand amongst the people, almost collectively, for a political resolution. And then one thing that is very significant is that we had genuine non-partisan external support, right? So the Americans in our context weren't saying we side with this or we side with that. They provided an opportunity or a voice of support, right? Whereas you obviously don't have that in the context of Palestine. You've got an American actor that's financing and supporting the Israeli state, supporting the genocide, etc., and the infrastructure. So there's no genuine, peacemaker, let's say, if you want to use that language. But in Belfast or in the north of Ireland, we still have residual issues. We still have segregation in very many areas. We still have peace walls.
So segregation, Protestant, Catholic.
Yeah, in some areas we still have Protestant areas, Catholic areas. We still have physical barriers that exist in the city. And in fact, we've actually built more of those walls since the signing of the peace agreement. What's that tell you about the nature of the peace? It tells me actually that peace building is a difficult process and it's precarious, but it's also imperfect. We still have the vast majority of children go to separate schools. The vast majority of people still marry differently, right? So all of that is what we would call a negative peace, right? It's a negative peace.
The absence of war.
The absence of war. But I take that over 1960s, 70s Belfast, 100%, right? But you can't export that model into the context of Palestine, where you have one hugely dominant nuclear-powered military in whatever in the Israeli side, and a Palestinian side that doesn't have an army, essentially, that is being ethnically cleansed as we speak, and that has no international support the way the Israelis have with the Americans, and then bring them to a negotiation table and say, negotiate the future. That's complete nonsense. There's no parity of esteem there. There's no equality there. And that's what's, people then are trying to do that because, and I understand, I disagree with it. Some people are trying to say, well, if we were able to sort it out in Northern Ireland, we can sort it out in this context. But the contexts are vastly different, hugely different, right? There's also territorial differences. There's cultural differences that are very significant. There's legacy stuff that's very different as well. Other actors that are different. So I think that's really important, that we don't allow ourselves to just sort of uncritically do that. And I'm beginning to see that now happening. Articles being published saying, the next step, and I saw an article today saying from a former British general who was involved in Iraq and Afghanistan, saying we were able to disarm the Taliban, or we were able to disarm Iraqi militias, we'll be able to do, and we were able to do that with the IRA, we'll be able to do that with Hamas. And you're thinking, this is very, very different set of affairs, because the IRA had a political avenue. There was a genuine, I would say, a pathway to achieving their goals politically, which is the unification of the island of Ireland, which is written into the Good Friday Agreement. There's a political pathway to achieving that. Yeah. Whereas the Palestinians are staring down a genocide. Yeah. So the notion of disarming before a genocide is just, it's preposterous. Yeah. So that is going to be really significant, right? And it's important that we push back against that, But if the notion is that peace is exportable and we should have peace in places, fine, whatever, Not to be whimsical, peace is important, of course, but it can't be a weaponized peace or peace based on one group's erasure. No. What peace is that? No.
Coming to the conclusion of this interview, and we have covered quite some ground, I would have to say. Is there a message to the world that you would like to... I know I make it a bit melodramatic, but you have seen, you were in the midst of it. You were in Palestine. You were not there for a couple of days, you worked there. You know people, you have contacts, you do research. Yeah. What's your, maybe for yourself, what's your conclusion? What's your outlook?
That's a really, really good question. Because what I'm witnessing now amongst colleagues, comrades, people who have given a lot, and I'm talking about people, let's say in the West, who have been involved in solidarity work and involved in pushing the conversation forward, right? I'm beginning to see a sort of sense that we have a moment or a ceasefire in place, and maybe the energy is sort of slightly waning or slightly dropping. I would say that we are at a more critical time now than we were a year ago, and that may seem a bit dramatic, but my point is what comes next is extremely important, because all we have now is a partial silencing, and even this idea that there's a ceasefire, by the way, is complete nonsense, because the Israelis have still been killing Palestinians. We're seeing a partial silencing or partial dampening. What we need to be really redoubling our efforts and recalibrating our imaginations towards is, what does the next step look like for the Palestinian people? How can we support a complete dismantling of the apparatus of occupation? How can we ensure demilitarization of the Israeli state? Not the demilitarization of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, a demilitarization of the Israeli state that has shown itself to be an incredibly destabilizing aggressor in the region, right? How can we as colleagues and comrades move that conversation on? And then when we're doing that, how can we ensure that we center the conversation around justice? Because there's no point in just having a hiatus. We have to have bigger imaginations. It can't be the case that we return to 2023 just because of the level of destruction we see now. Some people will say, well, Jesus, it wasn't as bad in 2023. Okay, but in 2023, Gaza was still under a military siege, We still had all the issues, freedom of movement was restricted, open air concentration camp, because I think that's important. Our language is important, as you know. So I want us to imagine something bigger and to keep pushing more determinately, and not to lose sight of our language either, to be very direct and very clear about this and not be silenced and be worried about being silenced. I'm concerned that people will see the ceasefire as the end, okay, because we have had a huge awakening. There's no doubt about it. Palestine is now a major political issue for a lot of young people, unquestionably. So how do we harness that energy and push it forward? How do we make sure that people understand the situation in Palestine through other things that we've talked about in terms of globalization, in terms of the civil liberties that we take for granted, in terms of the restrictions we're going to face? How can we close that gap and make sure people understand that these are all interlinked? So we've got work to do. I think this is the beginning, and it's a return to the beginning. And so it's about harnessing that. So let's not lose sight of that, I think. And let's also make sure that when we're doing these things that we center the Palestinian people in that conversation. You know, Richard Falk has a very good turn of phrase that he uses in one of his books. He says, for too long the Palestinian people have been talked at, talked for and talked about. And I just hope that as allies our role should be at the back, pushing the conversation forward.
That's what I think. Brendan Browne, it was my pleasure talking to you.
It was my pleasure being here.
Thank you for taking time to come here in this kind of improvised setup. Really appreciate the time you spent.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, man.
Thank you.
If this conversation stirred something in you, maybe a question that won't quiet down, maybe an uneasy feeling you can't quite name, great, that's the point. So don't scroll past it, follow it, see where the echoes lead. And you can find them in my archives on YouTube and on Substack. There you find the threads connecting what the headlines keep apart: politics, propaganda, psychology and power. Go there if you're done consuming and ready to start seeing. Because understanding the present always begins with recognizing how the past keeps rewriting the script.